Okay, still on where do we go? Where do we go from here, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Now he's really, now he's really hitting me in the grill. Now he's starting to get real with the information. And the scary part is how much this information still applies right now. Let us look at the size of the problem through the lens of the Negro status in 1967. When the Constitution was written, a strange formula to determine taxes and representation declared that the Negro was 60% of a person. Today, another curious formula seems to declare that he is 50% of a person. So now we have decreased since 1776. We went from 3/5 of a person to now 50% because we are second-class citizens. Of the good things in life, he has approximately one half those of whites. And the bad he has twice that of whites. I don't even think that that needs to be explained. If it does, leave a comment. They are a structural part of the economic system of the United States. This going into of employed Negroes, 75% hold menial jobs. The depressed living standards of Negroes are not simply a consequence of neglect, nor can they be explained by the myth of Negroes' innate incapacities or by the sophisticated rationalization of his acquired infirmities, family disorganization, poor education, thus and so forth. Hence, we already talked about the Kerner Report. We know that that's just not true. Economic discrimination is especially deeply rooted in the South. And he goes on to talk about how the Negro has been and has maintained being the cheap labor that builds the country. Said the brief facts disclose the multitude of the gap between the existent realities of the goal of equality, which is the second phase or the second anticipated phase of the civil rights movement. And he goes on to say that yet they would be less disturbing if it were not for the greater difficulty. There is not even a common language when the term equality is used between blacks and whites. The Negro and white have fundamentally different definitions, and to this day we still do. The George Floyd situation really brought that painfully to the forefront of our consciousness as to where white people began asking the same question they've been asking for 400 years. What is it that black people want? What is upsetting you? White America is not even psychologically organized to close the gap. Essentially, it seeks only to make it less painful and less obvious, the gap. But in most respects, they function to retain it. And many good observers have remarked that if equality could come at once to the Negro, that the Negro would not be ready for it. And I submit, this is Dr. King, that white American is even less prepared. And this is, he moves into, he diverts away from that and goes into law, which is aligning with Malcolm X. Every civil rights law is substantially more dishonored than honored. Legislation that is evaded, substantially nullified, or and unenforced is a mockery of law. And Even the Supreme Court, despite its original courage and integrity, curbed itself from only a little over a year after the 1954 landmark cases when it handed down that its pupil placement decision, in effect returning to the state's power to determine the tempo of the change. So we're seeing how this is no different. He could have gone all the way back to the Reconstruction amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, 13th, freedom, slavery, 14th, equal protection under the law, 15th, voting. If any of those were followed, we would not have had the 1964 and 65 legislation. So this is what he's articulating here. The characterization is necessarily general. It would be grossly unfair to admit the recognition of the minority of whites who genuinely want equality. Their commitment is real, sincere, and expressed in 1,000 deeds. But they are balanced at the other end of the pole by an unregenerate segregationist who have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. And I dare say that that is conscious or unconscious, because a lot of this is cultural. A lot of this is cultural. A lot of this is cultural. So a lot of this is unconscious. But I would dare say that that is how most white Americans feel. That that they're not interested in righting a wrong, balancing, and to an extent, Americans. Because we're not trying to right a wrong with Native Americans or Mexican Americans for their land that was stolen, or their family members that were murdered, where reparations could come into play. So as Americans, we don't bring that into our consciousness either. So that's not to escape us as Americans, but just speaking in the black and white conversation. The one thing that we have to do is, the first thing is just be real. We have to accept that something is there. And the fact is that white people don't want to correct. And when I say white people, I'm speaking very generally, as Dr. King said in here. It's about doing a good thing, not the right thing. A good thing is, well, cut the hoses off. Don't stick the dogs on them. Don't hit them with the billy club. But no, don't take away my advantage and my son's advantage of getting a job, because we got to eat. So, and he's going to move into that. They are uneasy with injustice, but unwilling to pay a significant price to eradicate it. I'm back to reading out of where do we go from here? Based on the cruel judgment that Negroes have come far enough, there is a strong mood to bring the civil rights movement to a halt, or to reduce it to a crawl. The argument that the Negro has made no progress in a decade of turbulent efforts rests on the demonstrable facts that paint the ugly picture of stagnation in many areas, including income levels, housings, and schools. The struggles in the past decade were not national in scope. They were Southern. They were specifically designed to change life in the South, where the principal role of the North was left unsupported. Now, this is where I'm getting educated. This is where this dude hit me in the mouth back in 1967, and I was too ignorant to read and find out what I needed to find out. What he's saying is, he's about to start breaking down why it didn't work. The mistakes that were made, but had to be made for new phases to be designed and put in place. The situation was so bad in this country that they had to hit the hardest area first. It's that old adage of you come to your house, the front door is open, the phone's ringing, the dog ran outside, and the house is on fire. Which one do you address first? The house was on fire in the South. Okay, we're getting people hung. They're not allowed to participate in their government. The situation was much worse. And if you had to prioritize it, you had to start down there. And unfortunately, it was so bad in the South that it looked like it was good in the North when it wasn't. But in addressing the South, two things happened. It increased aggression in the North, and it made people begin to compare, because they're looking at, okay, well, you all are helping these people down here, but we're catching hell in much different ways, but real ways up here. They had segregation and violence in much higher levels in the South, but in the North, they had legalized poverty. They had legalized, and I'm talking disproportionate. I'm talking purposeful. I'm talking design. Whereas the country is designed to have a substantial amount of poor people, but disproportionately, it was designed for minorities. Indians were killed. The Mexicans and Orientals that were used to build the western part of the country, the Chinese were sent back to China, and Mexicans were moved out of the country. They were sent back to where they were going to be when they weren't used for voting purposes. And in many ways, they were absorbed into America's whiteness in the 40s when they needed to, quote unquote, whiten America. That was when Italians and Irish and Jews and Russians and Polish became white in America. They weren't before that, which is why they were doing the organized crime that they call black crime now. Black on black crime. But not getting too far off the subject. That disparity made an imbalance in reaction from people in the North from the people in the South, because everything was focused down there. That was what a lot of people didn't understand. It was not a national movement by design. It wasn't purposeful, but new problems came about as they began to fix something. As you began to take something loose, you began to see how many other things are wrong. And now he's going down the road of, these are the other things that we saw wrong, but what did we accomplish? What did we stabilize? What foundation was made for us to properly build on? That's where he's moving now.